All right. We have a question today. If you're new to Lighthouse, we start our time together with a question. You are welcome to stand up and answer it. If you choose, Lion will bring a microphone around to you. And it's kind of a general question, and so I didn't want to define it too narrowly, so you can kind of go any direction you'd like with this question. Name a time when you felt truly free. Free of something, at least. Name a time that you felt truly free. There we go.
I'm excited. Well, I am not a spontaneous person by any means, but me and my best friend went on a trip the last summer, and on our way through, we stopped in Jackson Hole and went whitewater rafting, and I was scared out of my mind, and then the guy that was running our raft had said, oh yeah, we're in a, class 2 or whatever, you can just jump out and go in your life jacket. And of course, my best friend is the first person to jump off, and she's like, come on, we're never gonna be able to do this again. And it was the most freeing thing ever, laying there in the life jacket, looking up at everything God made. It was amazing. So
Cool.
Can't wait to go do it again.
Good answer. Thank you, Steph. There's one back here.
Whenever I ride bike.
Good answer. Thanks, Eric. Back here.
I keep getting accused of talking too much, but I had to respond to this one. We go down to Florida once in a while, and I always go deep sea fishing. And when you're standing in front of the boat heading out into the ocean, it just seems so free that you can't see land, you can't see anything. It's just me and God in the water and people in the boat with me. It seems like a very freeing experience.
Just real quickly, I went with Dad deep sea fishing once in Hawaii. This was several years ago, and the only free I felt was freely letting things go from my stomach.
That's free. I think when I really felt free is when I had a person that I've known that was pretty close to me for a while that actually left my sister and their 2 little ones, and for 25 years I carried that grudge or hatred, I guess, in my heart, and I ran into him one day and I went up and said I forgive him, and he just said the same. So that's being free.
Very good, Gene. Thank you for sharing that.
Mine's kind of contradictory almost, but I feel the most free when I have the most structure in my life, spiritually, physically, and emotionally, because I don't feel like I have anything to worry about at that time, so that makes me feel free.
Very good. Very deep answer. Anybody else?
I felt free when I first started ice skating.
When you first learned to ice skate, or when you ice skate? Awesome. Very good. Anybody else? We can do 1 or 2 more.
I guess right about now in my life for the first time in a long time.
All right, you don't have to say any more. Thank you, Shane. Awesome. All right, I don't see any more hands, and I'm gonna just make an obvious one, because I know that we have a fair number of people here today who are in the recovery community, and let me just kind of, we don't have to be shy about that in this church. When was a time you felt free? When you stopped using? Okay, pretty simple. I'd like you to grab a Bible and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12. We have two different page numbers in the Bibles around us, page 952 or 873. 952 or 873. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12. In the Recovery Bible, it's 1462. And I'd like you, if you have a Bible and you found it, I'd like you to read it out loud with me. Chapter 6, verse 12. Let's read together. You say, I am allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for you. And even though I am allowed to do anything, I must not become a slave to anything. I won't be a slave to anything. Or another translation of that verse says, I won't be mastered by anything. Do I look like the master of self-control? Thank you, whoever answered. You know, my motto in life is, if a little bit is good, then a lot is what? Even better, yeah. Many of you have heard me tell the story that when my son was in elementary school, we were out for pizza, a favorite in my household. And my son said, how in the world do I know when to quit eating? And I told him this life lesson that has just stayed with him his whole life. You eat until you're full, and then you have 3 more pieces. You know, I work out quite a bit. I don't know if you're aware of that. I'm not addicted to working out, but I actually go to the gym 5 or 6 days a week for pretty close to an hour and a half. Just think about that. I have to work out an hour and a half every day just to still look like this. You know, there are people who work out as much or or less than I do who look really buff. But I have to work out this much just to continue to look like this. We went on a men's retreat, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, and I realized, I mean, you can ask any guy around you, what we did for the most part was eat for 24 hours. And I found myself right away the first evening rationalizing with this whole table of chips and dip and brownies and Rice Krispie bars. And that wasn't, I mean, that was just the extras. I found myself rationalizing, well, it's only for 24 hours. It's only for 24 hours. We do that in our brain. Now, you know, there are all sorts of things that we might struggle with as human beings, and we can make light of lots of them because, you know, they're just kind of normal things, we tend to think. But some of our struggles and our addictions can be much more painful and much more difficult. In the midst of my own personal and professional struggles, a few years ago now, as I dealt with some burnout and depression, my use of alcohol crossed a line into an addiction. And my choice of escape and self-medication crossed a line into a new reality for me, where it began to control me. It began to master me. And it mastered me in such a way that I lost the freedom to drink and lost the freedom to choose not to drink. I just defined addiction for us. I crossed a line where I lost the freedom to drink, but I also lost the freedom to choose not to drink. In other words, I was now a slave to something in my life. We're in a series here at Lighthouse where we have been talking about the last couple of weeks mental illness and mental health. We've talked about the illnesses or the diseases of things like depression. And today what we want to do is we want to talk about addiction. And it's an important topic for any church, Took me about 26 years to deal with this topic in a church. And I think it's important for this church because we have tried to define ourselves not as a recovery church, but as a church that is very sensitive to the needs of recovery from a variety of kinds of things, and who wants to have a recovery ministry. So today we're going to talk about addiction, and I want to start off by laying just a little bit of groundwork for you, especially for those of you who may not struggle with addictions in any direct way, which is probably nobody in this room, by the way. In some ways, I want to destigmatize some words and concepts. So here we go. Number one, to be human is to have addictive tendencies. Can we just admit that? Come on, let's just admit that. To be human is to have addictive tendencies. Now, some of the things that we might tend to become addicted to are going to be a lot less dangerous than others. But to be human is to have addictive tendencies. You know, we should know that as Christians at least, because the Bible talks about it. Turn in a Bible to Romans chapter 7. And in our church Bibles, it's either 940 or 862. 940 or 862. Romans chapter 7. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and Romans. And listen to Paul talk about the struggle with sin that he encounters. It begins at verse 14. He says, "So the trouble is not with the law, for it is spiritual and good. The trouble is with me, for I am all too human and a slave to my sin. I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. But if I know that what I am doing is wrong, this shows that I agree with it, the law is good. So I'm not the one doing wrong, it is sin living in me that does it." In other words, you know, I know good and bad, I know right from wrong, and for some reason I still do the wrong things. "And I know that nothing good lives in me, that is in my sinful nature. For I want to do what is right, but I can't. And I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway." Does that sound familiar to anybody? But if I do what I don't want to do, I'm not really the one that doing wrong. It is sin living in me that does it. Now that doesn't mean that we don't claim responsibility. What it means is that we all start from a place in this life, in this broken world, of something called original sin, where we have this tendency to do things that we know we shouldn't do, even when we know we shouldn't do them. And so we all have, addictive tendencies. To be human is to have addictive tendencies, all right? Number one. Number two, I want to destigmatize the word addiction today. Addiction is not a bad word. It's not an evil word. It's not even a word that we should be embarrassed about. It's a word that we should actually be able to admit in front of others and then begin to deal with. One way to do so is to admit that we all have addictive tendencies. And it may be to, something other than alcohol or drugs. It might be food, it might be video games, it might be pornography. It might be, we can become addicted to good things. I know people who are addicted to exercise. I just want to go up and tell them, eat a pizza for heaven's sake. A lot of you struggle with an addiction to your work. Number three, addiction is an illness. It's a disease. Just as depression is a brain illness, so is addiction. And we're going to try to unpack that a little bit this morning, and I hope that it's helpful to you. Number four, because it is an illness, it's treatable. Because it's an illness, it's treatable. And there is hope for you and for me. And fifth, all these positive things I've said and wanting to destigmatize it, one of the things that we want to just acknowledge today is that addictions can be deadly. Addictions need to be dealt with. They can be deadly. or they can really mess up our life. And, you know, we may think, well, I'm just addicted to food. You know, you don't have to even talk to a dietitian to know that, you know, that the way we eat has an influence on us in our health. I know people my age who have died from alcoholism. I mean, we probably don't even need to go further. Even addictions that may not be deadly ruin lives. They ruin lives. And so it's a prison. And what Paul says is that I don't want to be enslaved. I don't want to be mastered by anything. And so we're going to deal with the kinds of things that we struggle with in this daily life. I want to call the guys up. We're going to be joined by George and Tim and Mark as well today. And today is going to be George and Tim's last day with us on Sunday morning. Well, hopefully they're going to come back. But last time up front. And Mark is going to help me out next Sunday as we talk about the spiritual life and journey and mental health. But I want to start by, I mean, this, in some ways, this is kind of an easy thing for Tim and George to do because we're asking them questions about what they do for a living. But on the other hand, it's also a gift to us. So why don't we thank George and Tim for these last few weeks. And we're going to just jump in. I have some questions for them. We're going to have a discussion. And then tonight you are welcome to return as we go a little bit deeper into these subjects. Let's talk about addiction. I've tried to destigmatize it a little bit. Anything else that we want to add to just kind of defining what an addiction is?
I went to the dictionary.
Okay, cool.
Because that seemed to be the simplest way, because sometimes, even though I work in the field, there's opportunities to learn. So I went directly to the dictionary, and addiction is defined as a strong and harmful need to regularly have something or do something. Very, very basic. There's another definition, a compulsive need for and use of a habit-forming substance such as heroin, nicotine, or alcohol, characterized by tolerance and by well-defined physiological symptoms upon withdrawal. So,
okay,
there's a lot there in a very small paragraph.
Let's go a little deeper into that. And one of the things that I've learned in my own journey is that addiction is a disease. And the reason why is because, not unlike some of the mental health things we've talked about the last couple of weeks, it's a disease of the brain. Something happens in our brain when we become addicted. Tim, can you explain that to us a little bit so that we understand that in a deeper way?
In our brains, there's reward centers. And when we're doing something that we enjoy, for myself, it would be like downhill skiing. If I was downhill skiing, the reward centers in my brain would be activated. For people that are using substances, their reward centers, it's like throwing rocket fuel on those reward centers. So people want more and more and more of that. And what happens, eventually, that's really the only way they're going to get pleasure, is using.
Yeah, what I understood is that the parts of our brain that send off the endorphins or the serotonin, they do those things naturally.
Yeah. Yep.
And they do things from something that might give us pleasure.
Especially dopamine.
Especially dopamine.
Yeah.
But as the use of a substance or another addictive behavior increases, our brain says, I don't need to send that off anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so it becomes dependent on...
Correct.
Okay. One of the things that I think is that we want to deal with is that if addiction has a center in our brain, and it's easy to talk about addictive substances, but it's not just substances that create that, correct?
Yes.
I mean, what else can we be addicted to, and are they the same?
A lot of what's happening in your brain is the same, and there's lots of different addictions that people can have. Dale already touched on several. I mean, exercise can be one of them. for the most part, we want to exercise. We want to, for our cardiovascular health, but there's some people that'll do it way too much. People that have, say, anorexia, they could be exercising 7-8 hours a day, and they're already very, very thin. People can be addicted to pornography. They could be addicted to food. They could be addicted to video games. There's many different things that people can be addicted to.
Okay. One of the things that I encountered in my own treatment experience were pictures of brains, brain scans that were done where people were addicted to something. And a lot of the brain scans can show where parts of the brains have ceased to function in their normal capacity. And, brains addicted to alcohol or drugs don't look a lot different than sometimes brains that are addicted to pornography or video games. Is that?
That's correct, yeah.
That's correct.
If people have an opportunity, Frontline on PBS, they have a series on addictions, and you can see that for yourself. Methamphetamine is one of the things they were focusing on in that program, and how it fundamentally changes somebody's brain. The brain will actually start to shrink, and they lose brain matter.
Now, one of the things that I've encountered in my own ministry is that there's a lot of people who struggle with addictions to things that tend to be a little bit less dangerous or more acceptable, like food. How does food, and I know that we have people in our church who kind of struggle with that. They tend to self-medicate by food. Is that considered an addiction, or not so much so?
It definitely can. Again, it's something that is harming themselves. They'll eat, and what's happened when people eat, their brains will release dopamine and serotonin in the limbic system of their brain. I mean, they'll feel better by eating, especially things like chocolate. Chocolate in a person's brain will mimic what it feels like to be in love. People want to feel in love, and so they'll eat lots of chocolate.
Huh. Yeah.
I'm there.
Mark has been very open here at Lighthouse with his experience, and Mark has served as a pastor for many years and is in recovery now, and kind of comes at this whole conversation from a different perspective as me. So I don't know if this would be a good time for you to just share anything that you might want to share about your own experience or journey.
Well, I guess I can speak to this.
Nice and close.
I can speak to this a part of addiction that is not a chemical addiction, where you might, be addicted to heroin or methamphetamines or something like that, where you would actually go through a withdrawal. But you can become addicted, like I was or am, a sex addiction. For myself, it was in the form of lust and adultery. I was caught in that, and just could not pull myself out of that addiction. And even though I knew where it was leading, I couldn't stop. My own son said to me afterwards, as we were talking, he said, "Dad, didn't you think about us as you were going through this?" I thought about my job. I thought about losing my career, but I couldn't stop. Gambling, the same way. I'm a compulsive gambler. It doesn't involve any, chemicals that you ingest, but still just as strong a compulsion. Had to go through 12-step programming to finally feel free. It's been 2 years now since I've gambled. So
Okay, go ahead.
completely different from being addicted to drugs, but an addiction's still the same.
George, part of your practice is dealing with addictions and addiction counseling.
Yeah.
So Mark or I come into you and say, hey, here's the deal, here's what we're dealing with. What do you do? I mean, I've already said that we know that addictions are treatable. How do you start and how do you evaluate what might be beneficial or helpful?
Primarily in the beginning is to do an initial assessment of what the person is struggling with. And what I have found out in my practice and in my own life, what keeps us stuck so many times in our addiction is the shame and the guilt that surrounds whatever we're doing or not doing. And shame and guilt can be so debilitating and immobilizing. So I try to, as you were saying, Pastor, is to normalize the fact that many of us have addictive personalities, and no matter what the source of our addiction is or what we're using, in addition to being stuck in the shame and the guilt, a lot of times with the people I work with over my career, it's been something that's happened to them in the past. Some abuse that they've suffered, some unfinished business that they've had that they have not really dealt with. In my own situation, I was brought up in the Catholic Church, and you've heard stories about the Catholic Church and the abuse that happened to boys in the Catholic Church. I'm one of those boys. I never dealt with it my whole life, and I'm wondering why I've struggled with the issues that I struggled in. I didn't get into counseling for my abuse as a kid until I was in my 40s. So I was compensating by getting into by doing some things that weren't necessarily healthy for George. So it's all about doing the initial assessment, finding out what's really going on with a person, starting to get them into therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, I feel, works very well, where you're actually talking one-on-one with the person and finding out what the core issues are in the person's life. And it can go way back to childhood. Some things they may have even forgotten, but it still impedes them in their own growth as an adult. So that's what I would do. And then I would also do an assessment, and I have, I'll just read it to you real briefly because I think it's important that you know how we determine whether a person is abusing or dependent on chemicals. And there's certain criteria that we use, and I'll just read them briefly to you so you have an idea of where we're coming from. Taking the substance, whatever that substance is, in larger amounts or for longer than you meant to. Wanting to cut down or stop your use but not being able to do so. Spending a lot of your time getting, using, or recovering from the use of that substance. Cravings, having a lot of cravings or the urge to use the substance. Not managing to do what you should do at work, at home, or at school because of your substance use. Continuing to use even when it caused you problems in your relationships, whether they're work relationships or personal relationships. Giving up important social, occupational, and recreational activities because of your use of alcohol or drugs. Using alcohol or drugs again and again, even when it puts you or others in danger. Continuing to use even when you know that you have a physical or a psychological problem that may be caused by or made worse by the chemical that you're using. Needing more of the substance to get the effect that you want, that's called tolerance. And the last one is development of withdrawal symptoms, which can be relieved by taking more of the substance. So that's the criteria that we use to help people determine the level of their addiction or their need for services, either treatment services or continued counseling or both.
Okay, and so you help people then determine what track is the best. My understanding, and
yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, we just try to map out a course of action for them.
Okay, depending on the severity of their addiction and their resources as well as...
And what's happened in the past.
Okay, because you may help somebody stop drinking or using drugs, but they haven't really dealt with the issues.
Right, what's been successful for them in the past and what has not been successful, that type of thing.
Okay.
And to build on those blocks.
My experience in the treatment world is that treatment really serves the purpose of giving you some structure to, first of all, stop using. Second of all, to begin to learn some tools that you can now use to try to move past the addictive tendencies. and thirdly, to really give you some support. Is that a pretty correct understanding?
And I can't emphasize enough helping people work through the guilt and the shame that's associated with addiction. Because to me, that is the one wall that people hit sometimes, and they can't seem to break through it.
Yeah. Anybody who has battled addiction, shame and guilt are huge. We're going to talk about that a little more next week, actually, how we deal with shame and what that looks like. So we should just kind of mention some of the tools that are out there, the treatments for alcohol, drugs, but maybe other things, whether it's pornography or video. I'm a regular attender of Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and so there are meetings throughout our community where people can go to get some advice and help in dealing with their addiction to alcohol. But are there other kinds of resources out there besides just counseling, or other kinds of groups that we should know about?
Yes.
Okay. You want to mention any?
Prayer at St. John's has, inpatient. They also have a partial program or day treatment. Drake has intensive outpatient treatment. I see a lot of kids that go through that program. First Step Recovery, also a very good agency.
So good agency. I know those agencies, so that if anybody wanted to get some advice or help, any of us perhaps could give you some advice. Are there? Go ahead.
I often encourage people that, do they have a church that they attend? Do they have a pastor that they can talk to? Because often it's still a secret, even within their faith community, what they're struggling with. And so I encourage them, as part of their recovery and part of their counseling, I term it circling the wagons, getting as many wagons circled around you as you can. And your pastor or a church community like this one is, with a lot of support, can help you, can help normalize what you're going through, because many of the other people are pretty transparent about what's happening in their lives.
Yeah, and finding, sometimes finding the right place to come, even church-wise, is important, because there are people in churches, in this world where to come out with such an illness might disconnect you from the community.
Exactly.
So, we've really tried to carve out a pretty open perspective, that there is no judgment here, because we know that everybody struggles with something. Fairly said. Go ahead, Mark.
For Sexaholics, there's a group that meets on Monday nights. That's at Bethlehem Lutheran, 7 o'clock. For gamblers, Gambler's Choice meets, I think it's Tuesday nights at Lutheran Social Services. And they have a real good program there.
Okay.
I think for people that have been physically abused and sexually abused at any time in their life, there's a lot of good services in the Fargo-Moorhead area to deal with that, because I also think not addressing those issues, no matter what had happened, feeds a lot of our addictions.
Let me just ask, Ken, and we perhaps know the answer to this, but I'm going to make the obvious question. Can I just do it on my own?
We need a lot of social support to actually have the recovery. We need that sense of community. We need that sense of people are supporting me and people are with me. There has been people I've worked with that maybe they stopped smoking just cold turkey, and they could say, yes, I did it on my own, but for many, many people, that's very, very difficult.
I'd like to think I quit smoking on my own, but I know that it was my higher power that helped me, because I tried 1,000 times to quit smoking. And had I not quit smoking, I would have been dead a long time ago. But through the grace of God, I was able to quit smoking, but it was a struggle. It took me a long time. I didn't want to, because I enjoyed smoking, but I thank God every day that I'm not a smoker anymore. And that was one of my toughest addictions, was quitting smoking. And some of you may be struggling with that too.
Mark, could you do it on your own?
No. And that's the difficult thing, especially with sexual addiction. I knew that to come out to reveal that would be the end of my career. And so you're so isolated. You can't tell anybody, you can't talk to anyone. And so the odds of coming out of that sobriety are just so minute. I've read of studies too that even laboratory rats on their own, if fed an addictive substance in a cage by themselves, will become addicted. But then when put in with a bunch of other rats in a healthy caged environment, can become sober. So that speaks, I think, volumes to you need the support of a healthy environment, like a church, for instance.
One of the things that I thought it might be good to share just briefly today is that Mark and I have been in lots of conversation about recovery and his role here, and I'd like us to view Mark as part of the pastoral ministry of this church. He's just not paid at this point, and he's volunteering his time, but Mark comes with lots of pastoral experience and expertise that a church like ours needs. And so I want you to view Mark in that capacity as well. We're going to talk more about that. In fact, one of the things, we've only been able to touch things, and I realize what time it is. We've only been able to touch on things this morning. I do want to invite you back. This is an important topic that touches every family in one capacity or another. And so we're going to try to go a little bit deeper and into a little bit more detail tonight, and you can ask questions and get answers. But one of the things that we are hoping to offer eventually here at Lighthouse for our community is a ministry called Celebrate Recovery, which is not just for alcoholics, not just for drug addicts, but really is for anybody in recovery, kind of like how we define our Sunday evening recovery group. We're all in recovery from something. And Mark has been part of starting that ministry. So I'm going to ask him to just share a couple of words about Celebrate Recovery, and we're going to look at some of the principles that come from Celebrate Recovery that are based on the 12 steps, if you've heard about the 12 steps. So, Mark?
Yeah, I could go into great detail, but I'm not this morning. Maybe I'll share a little bit more in depth tonight. Celebrate Recovery has been in existence for 25 years, started by Rick Warren. Many of you have heard of him out at Saddleback Church in California. And he asked John Baker, who was a recovering alcoholic, if he would start a program for Saddleback Church and for addicts. And John Baker came up with the Celebrate Recovery program based on the 12 steps. It doesn't get away from that basic formula of the 12 steps as being necessary. But John Baker also discovered that the 12 steps and recovery from addiction is biblical as well, as we're going to look at up here on the screen eventually. Jesus had a lot to say about recovery.
Hold your mic up, Mark.
A lot to say about recovery, and especially in the Sermon on the Mount. Celebrate Recovery is very much like Alcoholics Anonymous, Sexaholics Anonymous, and all of the rest, but is different in the fact, a couple of ways. We celebrate recovery in Celebrate Recovery. In other words, I'm not ashamed to tell people that I'm addicted to gambling, that I'm a sexaholic, because hopefully I will be able to use what I've gone through to help someone else. And so I'm not going to keep it a secret. That's the first thing. The second thing is, whereas all 12-step groups talk about a higher power that assists us in our recovery, Celebrate Recovery narrows it down to Jesus Christ as our higher power. And so that's the basic difference there. I don't.
Yep, we're ready
we
to
have
go.
it up. I want to go somewhere where I can see because I might not
Just don't
have.
stand in front of a speaker.
Don't stand in front of the speaker. Okay. I'm going to read the different principles, and when the scripture reference comes up, I want all of you to read that aloud, okay? You don't have to read the part about the scripture reference, Matthew, whatever, but just read the scripture itself and realize this is all coming from just the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? Number one, realize I'm not God. I admit that I am powerless to control my tendency to do the wrong thing, and that my life is unmanageable.
Happy are those who know they are spiritually poor.
Earnestly believe that God exists, that I matter to Him, and that He has the power to help me recover.
Happy are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted.
Number three, consciously choose to commit all my life and will to Christ's care and control.
Happy are the meek.
4, openly examine and confess my faults to myself, to God, and to someone I trust.
Happy are the pure in heart.
5, voluntarily submit to every change God wants to make in my life and humbly ask Him to remove my character defects.
Happy are those whose greatest desire is to do what God requires.
6, evaluate all my relationships, offer forgiveness to those who have hurt me, and make amends for harm I have done to others, except when to do so would harm them or others.
Happy are the merciful. Happy are the peacemakers.
Reserve a daily time with God for self-examination, Bible reading, and prayer in order to know God and His will for my life, and to gain the power to follow His will. And there is no scripture backing for that one, but that is a crucial principle. And finally, number 8, yield myself to God to be used to bring this good news to others, both by my example and by my words.
Happy are those who are persecuted because they do what God requires. Well, our hope is to begin working fairly soon on a Celebrate Recovery program. If you'd be interested in helping with that in any capacity, could you speak to Mark this morning? And
Could I just
Yeah,
add?
go
This is my plan that as I see it. In order to start a Celebrate Recovery program here, you need about 10 committed people who are willing to start. And by committed, I mean meeting on a weekly basis for 6 months. I mean, that's dedicated. And that's to go through the 8 principles. There's materials put out by Celebrate Recovery, and in order to teach others, we first need to go through the training ourselves. So I'm looking to have an initial meeting 2 weeks from now, not next Sunday, which is Super Bowl Sunday, but the Sunday after that at, let's say, 9 o'clock here at the church on Sunday morning. Anybody that's interested, come to that meeting, talk to me if you can't be here for that meeting, and we'll keep going until we find 10 committed people who want to start.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. I just want to bring us to musicians, you can come on up. I just want to close today by saying that here this morning, there very well may be people who think, you know what, maybe it's time for me to do something. Or there may be people who are struggling with a loved one who has an addiction of one sort or another. Most important thing you can do is take care of yourself. Come to our Al-Anon meeting tonight. But in either instance, if you are struggling or if you care about somebody who is, we're just going to be around for a few minutes after the service. We're not rushing out. Is that all right? And you can feel comfortable coming up to any one of us and speaking about where you're at. Know that it'll be held in confidence, and if we can do anything to help you or to help your loved one, we will do so, okay? So let's stand and sing our closing song.